Julian Assange, the historic, famous political prisoner, publisher and journalist, lies stricken this weekend in Belmarsh Prison. I mean, literally stricken. It has been revealed that he has suffered a stroke on top of all the other psychological and physical health attrition that has occurred over 11 years now of his incarceration. First in the Ecuadorian embassy and for more than 2 years now in the maximum security Belmarsh Prison, usually reserved for mass murderers and terrorists, but still housing a man who actually has been convicted of nothing but being kept in conditions that are attracting the attention of human rights organizations all over the world. The British state, and the American state for that matter, are subjecting themselves to quite severe collateral damage to their reputations by remorselessly pursuing this journalist, this publisher. You've got to ask what it is about Julian Assange that has made them conclude that that damage was worthwhile. I thought we'd take a look at it through the lens of a former intelligence officer, former MI5 officer, Annie Machon, who joins us now. Annie, thank you for coming on board the Sputnik. My point is that, is it worth it for the British state, for the American state, to continue this to the detriment of their reputation around the world? And if so, why?
I think they would see the long game here. This is how they always deal with big scandals. They know that it's going to cause a reputational hit at the time when they do it, but they know that the cogs of the machine will keep grinding forward and the scandal will be forgotten as the years go on, as will be the victim of that scandal. So I think we've seen this time and time and time again in both the USA and the UK in their handling of significant whistleblowers who've come out. And yes, they do take a reputational hit. Their sense of justice is damaged. People will condemn them, but after a couple of years, who remembers? So I think they're taking this long view when it comes to the Assange case as well. Although I have to say, he's given them a very good run for their money, because this case has been going on since 2010, when he first broke into the global consciousness with the collateral murder video. So I think that's how they're going to be approaching it. They know it's causing them damage at the moment, but, you know, memories are short. People will move on and it'll all be forgotten, while this poor man will suffer a living death if he's extradited to America.
I have my doubts for reasons I shall explain, but for example, last week's court hearing in which his extradition was approved, countermanding the earlier decision of the court to refuse it, came on the very day, International Human Rights Day, and at the very time that a summit on democracy was being hosted by Joe Biden. Pretty unfortunate timing for them.
It always is. I remember when former CIA senior analyst Ray McGovern was beaten up and manhandled out of a debate involving Hillary Clinton a few years ago. And that was when she was speaking about internet freedom. They do pick their dates. But in terms of whether or not their assessment is right, that this scandal will be forgotten, that's a moot point. Because, of course, this has set an incredibly dangerous precedent for all journalists anywhere in the world if they want to try and challenge a US legal hegemony. So this precedent means that they are all equally vulnerable of summary judicial kidnapping if they try and expose the crimes of the American deep state. So that's why this scandal might not go away, because other victims might fall foul of it. And everyone's going to recall this and come back to it and use it as a precedent to carry on arguing. And this case is absolutely, absolutely egregious in terms of the extradition hearings themselves. Because if you look at all the arguments, very cogent, very powerful arguments, which were dismissed, I think her name was Vanessa Baritza, and she dismissed all these very cogent arguments. So we got to a point where she only disallowed the extradition on mental health issues, which again does not protect future journalists coming forth. Then we have a situation as well where other issues have come out since that initial ruling back in January this year, where we have a situation, for example, where one of the lead prosecution witnesses turns out to be an FBI stooge. He was one of the Icelandic team who worked briefly for WikiLeaks and is now a convicted fraudster. And he's actually confessed that he made up this evidence against Assange. But that evidence has now willfully been excluded from the ongoing hearings and will probably be excluded if there is an appeal. And of course, we've also had this year the scandal of all the CIA shenanigans behind the scenes, both of spying on him on the inside of the Ecuadorian embassy, but also the plots that they were allegedly trying to cook up, either to have him kidnapped or to have him even assassinated in a shootout on London streets. So all of this evidence should be included in any appeal that will be heard, but I'm sure they will try and shut down the inclusion of new evidence because they will say, well, you know, it was all that sort of stuff was excluded in the first hearing. We don't need to go back to that. All we need to do is assess what the Americans have said, which is vague promises that they will not torture him by putting him in a supermax or under special provisions if he were to be extradited. But we've seen with many other extradition cases coming up to Europe, to America, that the Americans' promises are not binding and their promises are frequently broken. And therefore, the promise to not torture Julian Assange when they get him is probably equally unreliable and shallow.
One of the cases cited in the court in London last week was the Mendoza case, a Spanish man that was extradited to the US on the promise that he'd be allowed to serve his prison sentence in his home country of Spain. A promise that was broken for 7 long years. And only when he won a case in the Spanish High Court and began to sue the American government was that promise eventually kept. Here's the point I was making about how I'm not so sure it's working. When I started, and indeed you started, taking a close interest in this case right at the very beginning, we probably could have fitted all the partisans for Julian Assange in this studio. But it's now a worldwide phenomenon. And Reporters Without Borders, the National Union of Journalists, Amnesty International, it's growing like Topsy, actually, the international interest in the affair and the calls for the cancellation of the extradition. I'm not so sure, like the Dreyfus affair, that this is going to be forgotten.
One can but hope. I don't have great faith in the UK judicial system, as you're probably aware, having watched what happened to my former partner, MI5 whistleblower David Shaler, who had to go through the same travesty of lots of different hearings and the judges overturning earlier rulings. And of course, he ended up in Belmarsh too. But yes, that is a very good point. And I think this might finally affect some sort of cultural shift in our perception of such cases. Whether that's going to help Mr. Assange himself, if he is banged up in an American prison and left to rot, is another matter. But it might future-proof and future-protect other journalists who just want to do their job. Now, let's bear in mind what Julian Assange is actually accused of by the Americans. I mean, the key allegation, apparently, is that he encouraged a source, allegedly, to help him get information about collateral murder in the Afghan war logs. And this source is refusing to testify. This is Chelsea Manning, who has been rearrested after being pardoned from her 35-year prison sentence by President Obama, and was rearrested because she is refusing to testify against WikiLeaks. So how they're going to even make this one minor charge stand up, I do not know.
Just finally, and you brought it up as a former whistleblower, former intelligence officer, what do you think the attitude in the service is? Any qualms about reading on Yahoo, not the Workers' Revolutionary Party, but on Yahoo, after a big investigation, that they might have been called on to get into a shootout around the environs of Harrods in Knightsbridge?
I know, I remember reading that as well, and I was absolutely aghast because it was claimed by certain unknown, anonymous insiders within the CIA that the British spy agencies were going to collude in this. Now, I do find that absolutely astonishing because the use of arms in the UK by spies, and often there were cases where the CIA or the FBI wanted to come into the country armed, and they were forbidden it. But this, of course, was 25 years ago. So if they have changed that position and they do, as vassal intelligence services, support that sort of violence on British streets, I think that shows a very dangerous moral slide that has occurred over the last 2.5 decades within our British spy agencies. They are there to protect our national security, our safety on the streets, They are not there to do the paid bidding of the American intelligence agencies. I find it absolutely disgusting.
So license to kill abroad, but not at home?
Technically, yes. So MI6, of course, under the Intelligence Services Act, 1994, Section 7, can get that license to kill if they get the prior permission of the Foreign Secretary. So far, MI5 has not had that. I mean, MI5 doesn't even have the power of arrest. They have to go to the Special Branch Secret Police in order to carry out arrests in the UK. So the idea that perhaps even just rogue elements within British intelligence, and they do exist, might have been willing to turn a blind eye in order to curry favour with their American counterparts would not be a huge surprise. But I still think it is absolutely shocking with what's supposed to be a notional democracy in the UK. It's almost up there with the idea that there was a brief consideration, I think it was way back in 2015 or 16, by our Foreign Secretary at the time, William Hague, who said, well, they were considering the idea of actually invading the Ecuadorian embassy in order to grab Julian Assange and drag him out. But that was knocked down because, of course, embassies are legally the territory of the country whose embassy it is. That would have caused a huge diplomatic stink and a really difficult precedent for the protection of all our diplomats around the world. But the fact that these extremes, invading foreign embassies, trying to kill or assassinate or kidnap Julian Assange out of a foreign embassy, or even having a shootout around London streets, and not just any London streets, the very posh London streets, shows, I think, the desperation, particularly of the US intelligence agencies, to try and grab this man and make an example of him and discourage others in the future.
And yet, let's rest upon their assurances. Annie Machon, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on board the Sputnik.